So if you say the Ukraine, it means, in Polish you can actually say going to the Lithuania, which you can't say in English. But that suggests where this all comes from. It's important to remember that English is not the master language for everything, and that very often the way we say things in English actually comes from somewhere else. So we say the Ukraine because in Russian and in Polish you can say na Ukraine. Yeah, I have this on the sheet this time. You can say na Ukraine, which is something like more like at, right? So you're going to some place which is not quite defined, as opposed to v, right? V Ukraini or v Ukrainu, which means in Ukraine, right? It's a place that's like, if it's a v, that means it can be contained. So it has a border, it's a defined place, right? Maybe a state, because a state has borders and a state is defined. So if you say na, you're not really talking about a state, and you may be talking about something which is kind of misty and undefined and maybe a little bit poetic, right? So in your reading up to now, like the article from Bududnitsky, who cannot be accused of being anything but a Ukrainian, it was still okay in the 60s for him to be saying, or maybe it was required of him, I'm not sure, to say the Ukraine. And while we're on the subject of, okay, so is that clear, the v and the na? So it's very important if you're speaking Polish or Ukrainian or Russian, right? And so, the Poles, it's interesting, the Poles all switched over in the early 90s, right? They switched over. When I learned to speak Polish, you were supposed to say na Litvia, but now people say, that means sort of at Lithuania, but now people say the Litvia, meaning in the state of Lithuania. And na Ukrainia, right, was how I was taught to say it in Polish, but now I would say v Ukrainia because it's a state, right? And the Ukrainians have very clear ideas about this too. Okay, so while we're on the subject though, you might have noticed that the capital of Ukraine is spelled a couple of different ways in your readings as well, right? What's the difference there? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Yeah. Yeah, one is a transliteration, exactly. One is so you guys know what transliteration is? There are many alphabets, and when you render from one alphabet to another alphabet, that's called transliteration, or transcription, technically. So in the standard English spelling of the capital of Ukraine for a very long time, until very, very recently, in fact, was Kiev, K-I-E-V. And that was a transliteration from Russian. In Ukrainian, it's Kyiv, hence the English transliteration K-Y-I-V, which is a little bit awkward because there just aren't that many words that don't involve like 90s punk bands, which have Y's and I's in front of them, right? The Y-I is not a normal combination in English. And this was an evolution. So in my early books, I wrote Kiev, K-I-E-V, just because I thought this has been standard in English for so long. It's not really such a big difference between Kiev and Kyiv. People reading English are just going to be distracted by this Y and the I together. Why should I do it? But then at a certain point, I changed. The last few books, I spelled it with the Ukrainian transliteration. And if you want, you can check and see when the New York Times changes, right? Because the New York Times always does everything right. Thank you, that was good. The New York Times always does everything right, but even the New York Times has to change from time to time how they're going to do certain things. And so you can check and see when they changed from spelling it one way to another way, because that represents a certain kind of cultural consensus. And so these things change, and the reason why it's interesting that they change is that these things which might seem to be superficial, like language, are actually very deep, because they're the things that you read and you take in. You don't call them into question, and then they may form how you see the world when you're confronted with something surprising. Okay, so the v and na, or the, is it a region or a country? Kiev or Kyiv, is it Russian or is it Ukrainian? It's a pretty big what is actually normal in English? Because this is really interesting, because you might think, let's say I'm assuming, many of you are native English speakers, all of you know English, or you wouldn't be in this class, or you're in this class doing some kind of weird meditation that involves listening to a language you don't understand, which is cool. You'll probably pass anyway. I'm assuming if you're doing that, you're taking it pass-fail. But you might think, well, in English, like we have a certain distance from all of this, there's a certain objectivity, whatever it is in English is somehow just neutral, right? But it's not. it's not, what it is in English has effects too, very much so. And what it is in English is also subject to change, as we've seen in both of these examples, right? Just in the little span of time between when your readings start and now, the basic uses in English for both the country and its capital have changed. And you're presumably, like, if you have kids, which I know that none of you are thinking about now, because when you signed to go to Yale, you promised not to get married and not have kids, I know. But when you have kids, presumably they will think KYIV is totally normal. Maybe you already think it's totally normal, right? And they'll think, it will not occur to them that it might have been some other way. But these things change all the time. Okay, now this notion of deep geography also has to do, so I've talked just about of words and letters. It also has to do with narratives, right? So a story can tell you where you are, right? A story can tell you where you are before you get there. And this occurred to me during this trip because I was talking to a bunch of American diplomats, and we were pondering, I mean, just to put it very briefly and brutally, we were pondering why every American gets everything wrong about Ukraine all the time. Right, like that basic question, which you can't help asking with respect to the war, because even the people who are supposed to know what they're talking about were totally wrong. It's a luxury for me to say this because I wasn't, but in general, like, everybody was totally wrong about everything with respect to the war, right? The Ukrainians are going to lose after 3 days. Okay, they can't possibly fight back. They're going to lose. It's a stalemate. Blah blah blah. Everything that the consensus has said in the U.S. has been wrong the whole time, and you can't kind of say, well, this is just a matter of like lack of military analysis or whatever. No, there's something else deeper going on, and we were sort of trying to ponder that together, and I think it has to do with the deep narrative that everyone is taught. Because the deep narrative that everyone is taught, all these diplomats were taught it too. Everybody who studied East Europe, almost everybody, not in this class, but almost everyone who studied East European history in the US has the narrative which says there was Kiev, and then, from Kiev, somehow there was Moscow, there was some kind of transfer, and the thing in Moscow is the same state as the thing in Kiev, even though that, I'm not going to say even those, I'm just going to try to tell the narrative. The thing in Moscow somehow inherited the traditions of the thing in Kiev, and therefore the thing in Moscow fulfilled itself when it actually incorporated Kiev in the late 17th century. That was somehow natural, that's part of the destiny of this place. And it's normal that Moscow and Kiev will be together forever. And in some way it's all Russia. It's all Russia. So I didn't do a good job with that narrative because, frankly, that's not what I'm being, that's not my job here to do a good job with that narrative. But that's the basic narrative, right? But the point is that everybody who has ever studied this has that narrative. And if you have that narrative, then it makes you think that Russia's a real place. And what is Ukraine? Because in that narrative, nothing called Ukraine ever appears, right? So there must be something suspicious about Ukraine. It must be somehow invented or somehow marginal or somehow provincial or in some way questionable. Whereas nobody ever questions Russia, right? No one ever, is that wrong? No one ever questions that Russia is a real place. No one ever questioned the Soviet Union was a real place either, and then like one day it ceased to exist, right? No one ever questions that Russia is a real place. There's a non-zero chance that the Russian Federation, as we know it, will cease to exist. In fact, there's a 100% chance that that shouldn't. No, there's a 100% chance the Russian Federation will cease to exist. All states that have ever existed have ceased to exist, right? There's also a 100% chance the United States of America will cease to exist. Probably not before you graduate. Don't worry, but unless you're a freshman, in which case, not so sure. But all states cease to exist, right? So any narrative about how something's going to be around forever is obviously going to be wrong. But my point here is that as I was sitting with my fellow Americans and thinking this over, it kind of seemed clear that the reason why Americans, people generally, have trouble imagining that Russia could lose this war to Ukraine has something to do with the fact that Ukraine isn't quite real in their minds, and Russia is, and they wouldn't say that directly. But the narrative which you're taught when you're younger is going to be there for you always, right? We live in time in one direction. Our history education happens in only one direction, and the things that get in first tend to stay, right? Now, we don't have to spend a lot of time challenging that narrative. That's not really the point here. The point though is that just if this is your deep geography, that this was always Russia, and then if it wasn't Russia, that was some kind of divergence, right? If that's the way you see it, then naturally your brain, when you get to thinking about the war, of course you're going to think Russia's going to win, because this was always Russia, and Ukraine is some kind of exception. Yeah, do you have a question? Oh, sorry. Okay. Always is a very powerful word, but it's also a very comfortable word. We really like always. We really like for things to have a kind of durability, continuity. We like for there to be something in the world where we know its shape, and we know its shape is permanent. And it is a little disturbing when it turns out that none of these things that we think are permanent actually are, right? That's a little disturbing. And so Russia has made it into the level, I think it's fair to say, you can correct me, I mean, I realize you guys are like young, you're from a different century and all that, but Russia has made it into the realm of the kind of calmly permanent, right? It's up there with, I don't know what, Star Trek, hydrogen, it's like things that have always been there, right? Whereas Ukraine has not. For whether that's fair or not, it's probably unfair, but I think that's the case. And we just don't like it when something which is always is called into question. So always is very comforting. And of course, Russia itself, that word Russia, in a deep geography, it's not clear where the borders of that Russia are. I mean, during this war, there's been a lot of really quite, let's call it ambitious Russian propaganda. They're now plakati. What do we call plakat? No, wrong. Billboards. They're now billboards. I mean, that's true, but like billboards. You got points for speed, though, both of you. And it wasn't wrong. I was just thinking of a different, like billboards. Now, billboards in Russia, which say Russia has no borders, which is one way to think about it, right? No borders at all. But my point is that when we think of Russia, we could be thinking of the Soviet Union, we could be thinking of the Russian Empire, we could be thinking of a lot of different things with very different borders. And since the borders change, it's a big place. We're not surprised to learn that a lot of things are Russia, right? A lot of things turn out to be Russia. Okay, so you get my point. Like, there is a reason why basically everybody except the military historians kept saying Ukraine is going to lose. And one of the puzzles of this class, if you want, is to think about why that is, right? Why would everyone be wrong? And the suggestion that I'm making is that this thing that I'm calling deep geography has something to do with it, with the words, the spellings, the narratives that indicate to us what is real and what is not real before we get into the empirical world. Because as I suggested before, if you read, there aren't that many military historians left, but if you read them and they're boring threads about logistics and all this stuff, they don't know anything about Russia or Ukraine, but they know where the rivers are and they know where the bridges are and so on. And they've done a much, much better job than the people who are supposed to be Russia specialists. Why is that, right? Like, why is it that not knowing anything about Russia seems to be an advantage in predicting who's going to win this war? And you see what I'm trying to suggest, that if what you know about Russia has this kind of metaphysical underlay, which is actually then pushing the empirical evidence around, that's going to be a problem for you.